Council in Boston in 2015. In 2018, became the first African-American woman ever to be president of Boston City Council. And she is running for Attorney General. And Andrea, I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you. And nice to meet you. First of all, did you just memorize that bio? You were referencing any papers. That's amazing.
I know that little bit about you, Andrea.
Thank
And
you.
I want to learn more.
Thank you. Thank you. And there are folks on here. Is that correct?
Yeah, so, okay, oh.
Sorry.
So this is our very low-tech hydrant. So basically they can see you there in the screen.
There's no one on the screen, so it's like...
And they've all shut off their cameras, they're very shy, but they're there, the five of them.
Okay, well, hello, five of you. Hi, Karen. Nice to see you. It's great to see you, and thank you all for joining virtually, and of course, everyone for being here in person. I'll just tell folks a little bit about me, why I'm running, and frankly use the bulk of the time to answer your questions and the issues you care about. I have to say, my husband used to live in Stoneham, so when we got off the exit, I was like, Dave, I'm back in your food. And I went by my local grocery store that's named for me, so it was quite delightful. Obviously I'm Andrea Campbell, and I frankly jumped into the Attorney General race, recognizing that families right now in Massachusetts continue to struggle, and are very worried about how they are going to survive, thrive, and prosper coming out of COVID. They're also at the same time very frustrated with government, and at points I think disappointed with government. What I've been stressing though is that we live in the best state in the nation, a state with such potential and promise, and I know it because I've lived it. My childhood was actually filled with incredible instability. My mom actually died when I was 8 months old in a car accident going to visit my father, who was incarcerated at the time. My father and my brothers cycled in and out of the prison system, and my twin brother Andrea died 10 years ago while in the custody of the Department of Correction. And so I've been expressing the fact that I think I'm living proof that a girl who grew up in public housing under such tragic circumstances could turn that pain into purpose. I'm the first in my family to go to college. I'm the first in my family to go to law school and become a lawyer. And I've dedicated my entire life to making sure that other residents in Massachusetts have access to the same opportunities I have. And why is that? So they too could thrive and of course reach their full potential. And I've done this in different ways. I started my legal career representing children in education cases, pushing for children to have access to the opportunities they deserved and entitled to, especially students with disabilities. I've done it as an attorney for Governor Deval Patrick, where I worked on all his legislation. The transportation agencies, the education agencies were all within my portfolio, and interface with the AG's office quite a bit, working directly most of the time with their government bureau. And I've done it as a general counsel at a regional planning agency that covered 101 municipalities in Massachusetts, pushing for regional equity, which I know is still a major issue in the Commonwealth. And I've done it as a local elected official. And so I'm running for Attorney General because I have also been stressing that this office is more than just, as some have described, the top cop or the chief law enforcement office. It has all the tools, the resources, definitely the talent and the human capital to make sure that every family, whether you're a family of 1 or a family of 25, that you have access to a living wage, to health care, that your children have access to an excellent education, that the communities in which we live are prepared and more resilient, and of course prepared for the next climate event or possibly the next pandemic, that of course we're protected against predatory practices and scams, especially our seniors, and that we are leading the way not just on climate and the opioid crisis, but also on eradicating racial disparities, which you also know still exists in the Commonwealth. And that is, I think, just the beginning of what this office can actually do to help all of us, including the average resident who is like, who is the AG and what are you talking about? But to help us in our daily lives. And so I'm excited to be here with each and every one of you. I'm really honored to have the support and endorsement of your great senator who's sitting here, Senator Lewis, in this race, Senator Markey as well, and now over 90 elected officials representing every single county in Massachusetts. I'm not taking anyone or anything for granted. I believe in working hard, hence why I'm here tonight, and we'll keep coming back. Hope to earn your support, and I really appreciate the time to engage tonight and answer your questions on the issues you care about the most. So thank you for having me. I can moderate discussion because to get everything back to
what's happening on the people on the other side of the computer. We just need a little coordination. And I do apologize, I mispronounced your name, Andrea.
Because we just met, it's okay.
Sure.
We just met, and I'll just acknowledge, I don't do this work by myself. Molly, my incredible team member, is walking around and singing the papers. So thank you. So if you are inclined to sign thousands of signatures, of course, to get on the ballot, we'll be honored if you consider doing that. Thank you.
Great, so we can take questions. In the back there.
Hi.
Hi.
My question is, one of the things that we've experienced with Attorney General Healy is a focus on, I would say, in a general sense, consumer protection, opioid stuff, environmental stuff from a consumer point of view. Can you talk a little bit about what's going to spearhead your office?
Absolutely, and so obviously under that chapter 9 grade, you can do a lot, right? Anything and everything when you think about how broad the scope of that particular legal provision is and statute is. I think what I think is fascinating is our current AG has really pushed the envelope on what's possible, and the opioid crisis is a great example of that. And it's a holistic strategy that she is using. One is lifting up that there is a problem, the opioid crisis exists in Massachusetts, and getting it so the average resident, as busy as we all are, understands that. The second is saying, okay, well, what are we going to do about it? She's gone out and built partnerships with everyone, even folks who maybe didn't see that they could play a role with addressing the opioid crisis, pulled them in, including organizations serving youth and others, right, to say, we have this crisis, how do we start early in having these conversations with our children? The third piece of that is, of course, using the tools in the office, and particularly this statute and other statutes, to say, how do we make sure that we are protecting those who are buying and purchasing certain types of prescription drugs, et cetera, that they have the information they're entitled to, that they have, when you're going in to get a prescription, things like that, monitoring and tracking some of that, and then, of course, going after bad actors and using some of these similar statutes to do just that. And I think, obviously, she's been out there stressing what that looks like and using these statutes to push the envelope of who those bad actors are. So I actually see this as a strategy that can be used for other things. Right now, what's coming up quite a bit for many families is a potential foreclosure crisis coming out of COVID. Who are the bad players that we can be thinking about there? Obviously, you don't want to start with the extreme of prosecuting people, but you can start by building partnerships, by talking to those who lend money, banks, financial institutions, and many others, community development corporations, to say, how are we going to work together in partnership to keep people in their home? What could we learn from 2008 and 2009? And then those who, and we know some of them, who are taking advantage of consumers in particular with these things, go after them if they're not being responsive. Another area that's coming up is in the context of seniors. We're doing a lot of calls to delegates. We're doing a lot of calls, of course, through various town committees. The number of concerns we've heard about folks in our elder population in particular, concerned not just about foreclosure if they can stay in their home, the phone calls they're getting, people door knocking at times to sell them things, how you prepare to retire, all of that. There are some district attorneys who are actually, I think, pushing for legislation at the State House on ways in which some of these institutions can be more forthcoming in certain provisions. So I'll give you an example. If you're an elder and you're going to a bank and you're preparing, to wrap up and figure out your expenses and whether or not you should put your home in a trust, et cetera, or open a joint account with your child, sometimes people don't realize if you do that with your child is entitled to all those monies too. And sometimes, not to suggest families are taking advantage of each other, but sometimes that happens. So how can the AG's office, working with district attorneys, who also are seeing some of these predatory practices from institutions or from relatives, push for some legislation that is designed to provide basic information, for example, to put in bold, if you do this, this is what you should expect or something like that. So I just do think there's a lot more that can be done in that context, particularly with seniors, particularly for the foreclosure crisis and other concerns that I'm sure will come up along the way. Wage theft is also a big one.
So we did say we would go back and forth between...
And I apologize, I could go on and on.
No, that's why we have you. Go on. We have no questions in the chat online, so, sir.
Yeah, take 20 minutes. Steve. George Soros is financially backing the election of prosecutors that refuse to enforce the law. The result is U.S. cities are caught up in unprecedented crime waves. Will you prosecute criminals to the fullest extent of the law? And is your campaign receiving funds from Soros or any Soros?
Oh, Soros, I didn't hear the beginning part.
Could I ask you just to repeat that, though, so the people in the,
Sure.
or repeat it basically up from there so that the people listening
Oh, I
at
see,
home
I see. So
can
George
hear.
Soros,
Yeah, want me to start over?
yes.
George Soros is financially backing the election of prosecutors that refuse to enforce the law. The result is U.S. cities are caught up in an unprecedented crime wave. Will you prosecute criminals to the fullest extent of the law? And is your campaign receiving money from Soros or any Soros funded?
I don't know who all the groups are, but I have no money from Soros. I would know, because we're fundraising every day. And the short answer is yes. And I actually already in this campaign have had to make distinctions, right, between a district attorney and the attorney general. And I think that's important. There's a lot of misinformation where some folks think that the AG, for example, oversees the district attorneys, they report to the AG. And I go, no, they are duly elected, they are independent, they report to the people. And so each county has different district attorneys that have different viewpoints. I absolutely think the AG's office has to work in partnership because most of the time you're actually referring criminal matters to a district attorney or to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Where I think the AG's office can actually do better through the Criminal Bureau in the limited office that it is. And I say limited because over the past few AGs, you sort of see the Criminal Bureau shrinking and other bureaus expanding with respect to certain policy issues. But the Criminal Bureau can do a lot more when we talk about public corruption. We hear it all the time, different types of whether it's elected officials, municipalities, or other folks, state police, overtime fraud, there's things that you see in the news and sometimes you don't see in the news, where this bureau in particular is charged with looking into that, investigating that. There's a whole state police unit within the AG's office that can do more of that. And so that's what I've been hearing the most, is how do you make sure that public officials, that I think actually should have a higher standard of expectation and integrity and exceptionalism, hold them accountable when they do something wrong, that no one is above the law, that no one should be treated as above the law. And in this particular case, what does it mean to actually equip the Criminal Bureau in the AG's office with the tools they need to hold folks accountable? And so the short answer is no to that guy. I don't really know who he is. But the Criminal Bureau, I think, can do a lot more on the cases that was in its jurisdiction and in purview.
Further questions in the back there?
Hi, how you doing? When you start talking about climate change as something we want to be involved with, I'm just curious, can you give us some specifics as to how you imagine that working?
Yes.
And what you would be doing?
Yes. Thank you for the question. I just got it.
Can you repeat it? So that
Oh,
the
yes.
people at
I'm
home-
so sorry.
Hey, oh, that's okay, but just so that people at
Karen,
home can hear.
And so there was a question about climate change and what the AG's office can do and what my vision is for what the AG's office can do with respect to climate change. Right?
Yes.
Okay. I actually just got this, I mean, it comes up quite a bit, as you can imagine, whether you are in some of the coastal parts of the state, or in rural communities, or in communities of color. I live in Mattapan in Boston, heat deserts, major issue right now. So there's a whole bunch of ways, I think, to tackle it. One is, again, I always give credit where credit's due and start from a place of gratitude. Our current AG is doing a great job, and we are considered a leader nationally. Many folks don't even know that. With California, with respect to our response to climate. And she has in many ways built upon the leadership of those who came before, but continued to nationalize the work and to put us on the map. Some of that has to do with their strategy and comprehensive strategy to name that climate as a major issue, to talk about it with a sense of urgency, of course, not to mince our words about the effects of climate. Also to look at going about after bad actors. ExxonMobil, of course, comes up. So that leadership has to continue, and I absolutely would. And that also gives us that national reputation of doing an excellent job. Where I think the work can be pushed further is particularly looking at gateway communities in cities, low-income communities, and communities of color, particularly those we deem to be the environmental justice or environmental injustice communities, where the AG's office has some small initiatives that they are driving that could be expanded upon with further investment. Springfield, they're looking at asthma rates. That's a major issue in other communities as well. Chelsea, they're looking at the expansion of green space. Another issue that is significant and could, of course, be expanded upon in other communities. Communities that need trees, a tree canopy, all of that, I think, is critically important in a way in which to go to target communities that feel like they've been left out, left behind. I was just on a Zoom conversation with folks in Boxford, talking about, well, one woman was talking about Ipswich, Carol, and I said, Carol, you have to let other people talk. But she was talking about the river, and it's not a matter of quality there, it's a matter of quantity. And the enforcement of some of our legislation that's already on the books when it comes to reporting and certain things that would make sure certain communities had access to water. And an equitable amount of water was going into their reservoirs. That's enforcement of our laws that are on the books. The same is true in Duxbury. They're worried about radioactive material going into their water. That's about enforcing the laws we have on the books, so that too, of course, needs to be a part of the conversation. Mirror and share enforcement, but then pushing some of these affirmative policy initiatives, which I think are quite innovative in ways to really stretch what the AG's office is capable of.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Further questions? Councilor Grigoritis.
Hi, councilors. Good to see you.
Hi, nice to meet you. I'm Jed. I'm the counselor for Ward 6, and just also in full disclosure, I'm a former AG employee.
Awesome.
Fantastic office, and currently work for the Mass Office for Victim Assistance. My question is if you could talk a little bit about how you would use the AG's office to secure more affordable housing across the Commonwealth. We are in a huge housing crisis. Melrose itself is in the process of approving a housing production plan to do our part. I think it's really one of the kind of key issues coming before us, and I think there's opportunity for the AG, and I'd love to hear what your thoughts are.
Thank you for that question, and thank you for the work you do. One of the first conversations I had, actually, frankly, a group of advocates or folks supporting me in the race were folks from the housing world, and we know it's a big and large one in the state. And part of that was based on my work as a local elected. So my first piece of legislation was passing the Community Preservation Act and fighting for that for the city of Boston, given how it was generating a whole bunch of resources in other municipalities in the Commonwealth. And now the question is, well, how do we get back to the State House and make sure we increase the match? So there are, I think, right, creative ways in which the AG's office, given the crisis and the housing crisis and just how expensive it is to live here, can be, I think, at those tables and at those conversations. I think I've been a little surprised that when folks talk about legislation they have at the State House, frankly, a lot of statewide offices and officers don't show up. So I think in certain contexts it's important to show up and push for those things. Sorry, that was awesome. I also think what also comes up is affordability, yes. So clearly there are, whether it's settlements or other resources available to the AG's office where you have flexibility on how you can spend those resources. If we think about the opioid crisis, if we think about domestic violence, if we think about violence in general, some of the leading causes of these things is homelessness. And I discovered that in my work. I remember being at a roundtable that I convened with folks grappling with domestic violence and providers who were doing the work. And one woman was going through a report they had put out where they said the #1 cause that was driving homelessness was domestic violence. And I said, excuse me, what? Why is that not shared anywhere? Because then that tells me we have to, of course, address that issue, but there's something else that is driving homelessness, so how do we connect them? And so you think about resources to create more supportive housing and other things as well, I think is really important. But the AG has the power to convene. So not just using the resources in the office to create more opportunities, pulling on our philanthropic community. All of the hospitals, I was just with some folks from Stewart today talking about the work they're doing to address social determinants of health. They have resources that they want to drive particularly to housing. How does the statewide office, working with the governor, DHCD, all the other agencies, come together to drive some of these conversations on resources that might be available to create more actual housing in certain pockets of the certain pockets of the state, that will meet the need of folks in those communities. And be specific, every community is different. I think the AG's office could drive more of those conversations and be a part of it. Discrimination also comes up as well. Major issue still is, and different types of discrimination, whether you were a voucher holder, low income, lead paint, the amount of families that are still dealing with access in terms of being able to rent because realtors and others don't want to address lead paint or comply with those laws. Discrimination has to be taken on, I think, fiercely and named. And then lastly, because I could be here for a long time talking about this, the other piece that I think has come up quite a bit, where folks, I think, want to see more of my leadership, and maybe that is because they see my previous work being bold and courageous on these things and these issues, is having the hard and sometimes uncomfortable conversations in communities around zoning, around building, housing, housing that is affordable, housing that meets the needs of, frankly, who is it? Our city employees, our firefighters, our teachers, our nurses. They work for the city and they can't afford to live in the communities that they're working in. So that's what we're driving at, and I think that has to be very much a part of the conversation, even if it's uncomfortable at times, to talk about how we do that in partnership. And I think that's important. You can't shy away from it because all of us are going to have to address this issue, which is a major one, just like we did with the opioid crisis that is affecting all of us. There's a role that each of us can play. Well, let's have a conversation about what that could look like. Thank you.
Kelly, have we had any questions over the chat?
We have not.
Okay.
We have a
Karen is here.
quiet, dedicatedly listening group.
Senator Lewis.
I said, come on
I
out.
just wanted to say, I think it speaks to the incredible strength of our party, the Democratic Party, that we have three extraordinary candidates that are running for Attorney General. And obviously this is, along with the governor's race, I think the most important decision we're going to make this year. If you don't know, the three candidates, Quentin Palfrey was our nominee for Lieutenant Governor last time around, a very talented guy. Shannon Liss-Reardon is an extraordinary labor attorney. She was actually a classmate of mine in college, so we go back a ways. But even in such a strong field, Andrea really stands out. And for me, it comes down to three things why I've endorsed her. She has the life experience that I want to see in our next Attorney General. She has the experience and the skill set, and she has the vision for what our Attorney General can do and really build on, I think, what in many ways Maureen Healy has so wonderfully done. So that's it. I just wanted to stand up and say it, and I really wanted to be.
That was unplanned.
And I will also mention that
That was very unplanned, so thank you, Senator, for doing that.
if you are curious about the other candidates, we have Quentin Palfrey coming next month and Shannon Liss-Reardon the month after that. So you'll be able to hear everybody here in Melrose.
That's right.
Further questions for our candidate tonight? Maybe one more. All right, hello. Okay.
I guess, since,
Please.
are there ways that you can use this office to hold people accountable for systemic racism and create change? And I wonder if you could
Yes.
talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So I didn't jump into this race lightly. What I did mention is I'm very faith-driven, so we're coming to the church, and I wear it on my sleeve. I speak about it very openly, and I pray on everything. And one of the things, when I was praying about this, but also doing my due diligence, talking to folks who work in the office, who previously worked in the office, about what you could do with this job. Because that's what it's about. Do you want the job at the end of the day? It's not just about running for something. Do you want to do the work? And what was most appealing at the outset was that this was the very office that could have looked into what happened to my twin brother 10 years ago. He was a pretrial detainee when he passed away in the custody of the Department of Correction. Yes, as the state's attorney, we represent that agency, but you can say, wait a minute, what happened and what happened there? And there are other families that have gone through a similar ordeal. And everyone, I think, regardless of where you come from, has had a loved one or someone make bad decisions or bad choices and end up in the system in some way. So that immediately pulled me in. And I think when you think about prison reform, criminal legal reform, yes, it is about holding people accountable for wrongdoing, but it's also about humanity, and it's also about humane treatment, and us being the leader and what that actually looks like in Massachusetts, just like we lead on other things as well. And there are major racial disparities still in our criminal legal system. And I used to represent children in education cases. And there was a lot of data to suggest that, frankly, at that time, kids, regardless of it, were all committing the same types of bad behavior, bad teenage behavior in these education cases. My clients that were clients of color more likely ended up in the juvenile justice system. We had the stories, but we also had the data to prove it. And so for me, I have 2 young boys. It is about breaking those cycles. And this office has incredible tools to do that, to leverage that power, to push that agency, and frankly, any other agency, to do better by our constituents. You know, if you are dealing with the climate injustice or an environmental injustice in your community in terms of asthma rates or something that's polluting your community, what are we doing to help those folks, right? What are we doing to address the racial wealth gap? A whole host of ways in which the AG's office can be showing up. The Civil Rights Division is doing amazing work every single day, some of which we're going to know about, where they, I think, want to be doing even more on these issues. And then one thing the office is doing is using a racial equity lens, which I firmly believe in. And our current AG is doing that. Continuing that work is important. But for me, I come with a sense of urgency because it is personal. And I have 2 young boys, a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. God bless my husband. He is the love of my life and near and dear to me. And I will say, we both are looking at our boys and saying, we want this generation to do better than the last. And isn't that what everyone wants? Even if you don't have children, the next generation should do better than the last. And that is the case, particularly for communities of color. We have to take on racial disparities. But we also have to talk about racial disparities as affecting all of us. It holds back our state from reaching its full potential. And there are ways in which to talk about that in layman terms so folks understand the economic impact of racial disparities, the leadership impacts, all of that. The credibility, I think, is important too. Thank you. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you.